Plessy v. Ferguson was a landmark 1896 U.S. Supreme Court decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. The case stemmed from an 1892 incident in which African-American train passenger Homer Plessy refused to sit in a car for blacks. Rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the Supreme Court ruled that a law that implies merely a legal distinction between whites and blacks was not unconstitutional. As a result, restrictive Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race became commonplace. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. All were enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by white Democratic-dominated state legislatures after the Reconstruction period. The laws were enforced until 1965. Common Jim Crow laws included literary tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause, which were all restrictions on voting meant to keep black men from casting a ballot. Bans on interracial marriage and separation between races in public and places of business were also common parts of Jim Crow. Plessy v. Ferguson, background and context. After the Compromise of 1877 led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, Democrats consolidated control of state legislatures throughout the region, effectively marking the end of Reconstruction. Southern blacks saw the promise of equality under the law embodied by the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution receding quickly, and a return to disenfranchisement and other disadvantages as white supremacy reasserted itself across the South. As historian C. Van Woodward pointed out in a 1964 article about Plessy v. Ferguson, white and black Southerners mixed relatively freely until the 1880s, when state legislatures passed the first laws requiring railroads to provide separate cars for Negro or colored passengers. The period after the Civil War, 1865-1877, was called the Reconstruction period. Cruel and severe black code laws were adopted by Southern states after the Civil War to control or reimpose the old social structure. Southern legislatures passed laws that restricted the civil rights of the emancipated former slaves. Black men were unjustly put in jails and made to go on work details. Reconstruction proved to be a mixed bag for Southerners. On the positive side, African Americans experienced rights and freedoms they had never possessed before. They could vote, own property, receive an education, legally marry and sign contracts, file lawsuits, and even hold political office. Black resistance to segregation. As Southern blacks witnessed with horror the dawn of the Jim Crow era, members of the black community in New Orleans decided to mount a resistance. At the heart of the case that became Plessy v. Ferguson was a law passed in Louisiana in 1890, providing for separate railway carriages for the white and colored races. It stipulated that all passenger railways had to provide these separate cars, which should be equal in facilities. Homer Adolph Plessy, who agreed to be the plaintiff in the case aimed at testing the law's constitutionality, was of mixed race. He described himself as 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African blood. On June 7, 1892, Plessy bought a ticket on a train from New Orleans bound for Covington, Louisiana, and took a vacant seat in a whites-only car. After refusing to leave the car at the conductor's insistence, he was arrested and jailed. Convicted by a New Orleans court of violating the 1890 law, Plessy filed a petition against the presiding judge, Hon. John H. Ferguson, claiming that the law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, Supreme Court ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson. Over the next few years, segregation and black disenfranchisement picked up pace in the South and was more than tolerated by the North. Congress defeated a bill that would have given federal protection to elections in 1892 and nullified a number of Reconstruction laws on the books. Then, on May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict in Plessy v. Ferguson. In declaring separate but equal facilities constitutional on intrastate railroads, the court ruled that the protections of the 14th Amendment applied only to political and civil rights, like voting and jury service, not social rights, sitting in the railroad car of your choice. In its ruling, the court denied that segregated railroad cars for blacks were necessarily inferior. We consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument, Justice Henry Brown wrote, to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. John Marshall Harlan's dissent alone in the minority was Justice John Marshall Harlan, a former slaveholder from Kentucky. Harlan had opposed emancipation and civil rights for freed slaves during the Reconstruction era, but changed his position due to his outrage over the actions of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Harlan argued in his dissent that segregation ran counter to the constitutional principle of equality under the law. The arbitrary separation of citizens on the basis of race, while they are on a public highway, is a badge of servitude wholly inconsistent with the civil freedom and the equality before the law established by the Constitution, he wrote. It cannot be justified upon any legal grounds. Plessy v. Ferguson significance. The Plessy v. Ferguson verdict enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal as a constitutional justification for segregation, ensuring the survival of the Jim Crow South for the next half-century. Intrastate railroads were among many segregated public facilities the verdict sanctioned. Others included buses, hotels, theaters, swimming pools, and schools. By the time of the 1899 case Cummings v. Board of Education, even Harlan appeared to agree that segregated public schools did not violate the Constitution. It would not be until the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, at the dawn of the Civil Rights Movement, that the majority of the Supreme Court would essentially concur with Harlan's opinion in Plessy v. Ferguson. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education overturned Plessy, finding that separate but equal was invalid and banning racial segregation. Southern states didn't give in easily, and the threat of military force was necessary in some instances to enforce desegregation. Justice Harlan disagreed with the majority of his colleagues and wrote a dissent stating that segregation violated the 14th Amendment because it used the law to sanction inequality among races. Writing the majority opinion in that 1954 case, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place in public education, calling segregated schools inherently unequal, and declaring that the plaintiffs in the Brown case were being deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. In a class action suit, 13 Topeka, Kansas parents representing 20 students filed suit against the Board of Education, stating that African American students should be allowed to enroll in the nearest neighborhood school. Oliver Brown was a parent in this class action suit. Lawyers with the NAACP represented the plaintiffs. The district court ruled in favor of the board, and it was appealed to the Supreme Court where they combined 5 similar cases under Brown v. Board with 200 plaintiffs. This case had a different outcome. Supreme Court ruling. Outlawed segregation in public schools. All government-endorsed segregation violates the 14th Amendment.